Literacy Live 2013-2014 webinar series, Balancing Prevention and Intervention. So in this particular webinar, we're going to be focusing on determining who needs reading interventions. What systems and structures do you have in place at the school or district level in order to identify those students who are in need of reading support? As a reminder, this graphic represents our vision for our webinar series this school year. And remember that our whole purpose is to strengthen universal instruction and intervention to ensure success for all students with grade level Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts. The goal for this particular webinar is to learn about a variety of processes and tools used to determine which students need intervention in literacy. Also, as a reminder, we are right now focusing on the left-hand side of that balancing chart about intervention. So when we're talking about identifying students who are in need of reading interventions, there are a lot of different intersections. So our selection of students really takes a lot of programs and statutory requirements into consideration. So first of all, we have Standard C, the administrative rule, which specifies which students need to be provided with reading interventions. We have rules around Title I. We have the SLD rule. And we also always need to take into consideration our systems for a multi-level system of support, the general systems and structures your school and district have in place. Ideally, the process for selection, including the tools you utilize, will be consistent with implementation of any of these priorities that apply in your setting. So today's webinar is really focused on two different kinds of questions: what questions and how questions. When we're thinking about what, we're thinking about things like what tool or tools in the examples that you'll see do you use for screening all students in your district? What information do these tools provide you with? And how does that information connect to the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts? If the goal is to improve learning for all students related to the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts, it's important that the screening tools that you're measuring with are actually measuring things related to the standards. What's the research base behind the tool? How does the tool reflect what we know about the science of reading? How does the tool reflect what your local beliefs and philosophies are about literacy? And then also how? How do you administer the screening tools to ensure fidelity? How do you store the data? What processes do you use to analyze the data? And how do you prioritize student needs? In today's webinar, as well as other webinars in the 2013-2014 series, some of your colleagues have bravely agreed to share their school and their district RTI stories. As we share these stories, we're working to respect the confidentiality of schools and districts and students. We want to remind you that there is no one right way to implement response to intervention or Standard C, and that the examples that you're seeing are examples of choices that have been made by real Wisconsin districts. People are sharing those examples in hopes of furthering our field. They're not sharing their stories to open themselves up to criticism or to necessarily even share exemplars. They're simply sharing their stories and where they are. In some cases, people will call in to share their stories. In other cases, Laura and I will tell people's stories on their behalf. So just recognize, too, that sometimes you're getting a primary source and sometimes you're getting a secondary source. Today, all secondary sources. So let's begin with our first example of a piece of screening data that is available to all Wisconsin public schools, and that's PALS, or the Phonological Awareness Literacy Screening. PALS in 2012, 2013, 2014, that's where we are now, is being implemented in 4K, 5K, and grade 1. Next year, 2014, 2015, that'll expand to include grade 2. So what you see on your screen right now is information about entry-level scores for PALS in 4K, 5K, and grade 1. 4K is not really serving as a screener. These are students a lot of them, this is 4K is their first opportunity to be in school. So because of the great amount of variability in students, there are no benchmark scores for PALS 4K, not in the fall. In the spring, there's a development range. But there are no benchmark scores. The assessment is meant to be diagnostic and a tool for monitoring progress. As a result, PALS 4K isn't really something that you're using to identify students for intervention. You're using it to drive daily instruction, and you have room in your instructional framework or structure to provide that intervention as part of how your class does business. In 5K and grade 1, you are required by statute standard C statute, to provide reading intervention for students who are at risk of reading failure. In 5K, that's students who do not meet the sum score benchmark on PALS, and in grade 1, that's students who do not meet the entry-level sum score benchmark for PALS. It's not enough to just look at the benchmark score, though, with PALS. You also get a lot of really rich information by looking at the tasks. These are the tasks that are part of the 5K assessment and the tasks that are part of the grade 1 assessment. You can use your online score entry system to look at students' scores, not just their sum score, but also their scores on tasks, and provide intervention related to specific tasks. Most likely that intervention would be incredibly targeted, probably offered right in the classroom setting, and it might be pretty short term. Because the scope of the intervention is so specific, you most likely will be able to move students forward relatively quickly through that intervention and onto something else. Our next example is shared by the Oshkosh Area School District. And so first of all, we really appreciate the contribution of the Oshkosh Area School District. And as Barb mentioned earlier, the whole point here is that they are bravely sharing their examples and their information in order just to be helpful to the field as a whole. So what we're going to share here is the Oshkosh Area School District screening process for determining eligibility. So the first thing that's interesting is that their process for determining eligibility has been in place since the 1990s, when that administrative rule, State Standard C, became law. And so everything was really kind of centered around that initially. The other thing that's very critical, I think, to understand is that when determining who needs to be provided with additional reading interventions or support, they always rely on multiple pieces of data, which we know is best practice. So the different data points that they use, you can see on the screen here in the PowerPoint. They definitely take classroom performance into consideration. They definitely take a look at our state standardized test results, which we talked about in that last webinar when we took a bird's eye view of our state reading data. They also have a process for individual classroom teachers to rank their students based on classroom performance and other data points. And they also take a classroom text reading level. That classroom text reading level is one of the data points that individual classroom teachers use when they come up with their own ranking of students as far as their reading abilities go. The classroom text reading level is determined using the DRA2. That's the district's common assessment. And that provides information regarding the student's instructional reading level, but it can also be analyzed to provide additional information about the student's use of phonetic information, fluency, and comprehension. Performance on this particular assessment may indicate that additional diagnostic testing is needed for the student. They also include referrals by parent, teacher, or what they call their care team, and decisions regarding services are made on a student-by-student basis. So at the kindergarten level, the information from the PALS subtests may also be used for determining eligibility before a student is tested using that common assessment, the DRA2, which I just talked about. Prior to implementation of PALS at the state level, a similar battery of early literacy assessments was used. But whenever we're talking about kindergarten, it's also very important to keep that idea of developmental progress in mind. And we know that kindergarten students are still coming to us with a wide range of developmental abilities. And so that definitely needs to be kept in mind. So once a child has been determined to be in need of additional support beyond that, which can be provided by the classroom teacher, students are also given additional assessments in order to rank them according to need. Other assessments may also be considered as deemed necessary. For example, a teacher may choose to give an oral language survey, a specific skills test, or other assessments to an individual student in order to gather additional information to inform instruction. So you can see here that at grade 1, one instrument that they use is the Clay Observation Survey. From between grades 2 and 5, they also rely on the Fontes and Pinnell assessments. And as I mentioned, other assessments as deemed necessary, such as the DRA2 word analysis, the Oshkosh Area School District alternate assessment, the NAEP fluency rubric, record of oral language, the PALS quick check, oral language acquisition inventory, second edition. Again, that idea that they're using multiple points of data. What you see here is an example of the eligibility form that the Oshkosh Area School District has developed, and this is used by classroom teachers in order to document information on students they have reading concerns about. So the literacy resource teacher, which is also the literacy coach at each building, uses this information to determine whether the student is eligible for additional support services beyond the regular classroom. And of course, some of the pieces of information that they take into consideration here would be a student's language learner status, for example, whether or not the student has an IEP in existence. Pieces of information like that would also be recorded on this form. And I think it's also interesting that not only is Oshkosh relying on formal assessment data, they're also definitely relying on classroom teacher observation. And I think we often overlook that piece as a data point, and I think that that's just really important to call out here. So again, services are provided to students in Oshkosh based on an early intervention model, which strives to provide support early in the child's school career in order to eliminate the need for long-term support. So they're also currently taking a look at their system in light of the new SLD criteria. And what you're seeing on this screen is the way that they rank students in order to provide services. And if you're familiar at all with Title I, then you're definitely familiar with this idea of the fact that you need to rank students in order to determine who you actually have the capacity to serve. Because of course we know that you may not have the capacity to serve all of your students. So in Oshkosh, services are generally provided in this order. So grades 1 and 2 for those students determined to be at the greatest need using some of those data points that I've discussed. Kindergarten at the greatest need. Third on the list would be students in grades 3, 4, and 5 who are at the greatest need. Then students at grades 1 and 2 of moderate need, and grades 3, 4, and 5 at moderate need. And these are some decision rules that the Oshkosh Area School District has come up with. Your own local school district would need to determine your own decision-making rules as part of your multi-level system of support to determine who should receive reading support. Oshkosh gives us some great examples of how Standard C and Title I and SLD rule are all really working together to create a system that's been modified over the course of a number of years. And their screening tools are changing. It's a fluid process with tools changing as new and better tools become available. The next example that we want to share with you is a high school example of what it looks like to select students for reading intervention. This example was generously given to us by the Menasha Joint School District. When Menasha started looking at screening tools for use at the high school level, they really started by looking at what assessments they already had in place. What were they already using, and how could those assessments that already had other valuable uses in the district also be utilized as screeners? So what they noticed was that they were using MAPs, measures of academic progress, specifically the reading test as part of that. They were using Scholastic Reading Inventory to measure students' lexile, and in 8th grade, students were completing the ACT Explore, which includes the reading component. So as Menasha was working to select students for a 9th grade reading intervention course, they looked at those 3 data points. Unfortunately, those 3 data points each have their own storage system. The scores for Explore were stored in one place. The scores from SRI were stored in another place. The scores from MAPS were stored in another place. So an important step in their process is figuring out how to put all that data into one place.
And I think that's a really important consideration for any school district is how do you manage your data? Mm-hmm. When you're putting your systems and structures into place, when you're making those decision rules, part of your decision rule making needs to be about how are you going to store this data in a way that's going to be meaningful and usable for your school and your district.
And ideally you have a school or just probably a district-wide data system that's going to store that for you and that's going to mine that data for you to give you the answers that Menasha finds in the spreadsheet that I'm about to show you. But if that can't be your reality for any number of reasons, I think this spreadsheet is a great example of a workaround. Before I give you much detail about the spreadsheet, I just want to point out that these screening tools that are being used by Menasha and screening tools that are being used by Oshkosh or screening tools that are being used by any district is not perfect. We're doing the best that we can under financial constraints. In the case of secondary, really under, I guess I'd call them market constraints. There's not a lot of assessments that are out there that measure secondary students' literacy skills in a fast and reliable way. So Menasha turned to this group of assessments because it allowed them to triangulate data. It allowed them to use data that they were already collecting. So they recognize that there's some limitations. Just like anybody's system, there's some limitations with the system, but it's really the best that they could come up with the resources that they had available to them. So what you see on your screen now is a sample of the spreadsheet. The students' names have been removed, and you see the 3 assessments across the top. You see a student's RIT score on MAPS, measures of academic progress. You also see their percentile. You see their lexile score as measured by Scholastic Reading Inventory, and you see the category that their WKCE score placed them in, and you also see their Explore reading score. Each category of data was cut and pasted from one spreadsheet into this spreadsheet where it's all housed together. So originally, the literacy coach, who was the person doing the manipulation of the data, was working with, I think, 3 or 4 different spreadsheets and bringing all of that data together in one place. Once you get the data in one place, you're able to manipulate how it's sorted. So the spreadsheet that you see on your screen now is sorted by percentile, the percentile student performed in MAPS. And that lets you real easily look across the screen. Like for student 1, you can see that their data is consistent. They were in the first percentile for MAPS. Their lexile score placed them at beginning reader. The WKCE score was minimal, and they scored a 0 on the reading portion of Explore. If you look down to student 15, you see that they were in the 5th percentile on MAPS, basic on the WKCE, and scoring a 10 on the Explore reading. So in those places where there's some inconsistency, you can certainly turn to more diagnostic assessment and also to some teacher interviews and some professional conversation and collaboration around an individual student.
I think classroom performance, again, would be something else to consider here. And another thing about that is that I wouldn't just rely on classroom observations by your English language arts teachers, especially if you're in a departmentalized situation, perhaps at the secondary level. I think you also need some classroom observation data from your social studies teacher, your science teacher, your math teacher. that would be equally as important and should come into play.
And anytime we're talking about a transition, the data that you're looking at on the screen now is spring data from students' 8th grade year. So anytime you're looking at a transition like that, you have the physical logistics of teachers who were in a middle school in a 6-8 building communicating their observations and their understanding of students' strengths and needs with another group of teachers who are working in another building. So really being deliberate about planning for those transitions. So in the case of Menasha, once they started sorting their data, they saw that more than half of their freshman class was scoring at the basic or minimal level on the WKCE, and more than half of their freshman class was scoring below the 50th percentile as measured by math. That's just simply not a realistic number of students to provide intervention for. So they really have a two-pronged approach, much like our webinar series. They're choosing a targeted group of students to offer intervention to based on what they're able to offer with the limited amount of resources, and they're also working on strengthening their universal instruction, making sure that they have an instructional framework in class that allows the teacher to provide universal instruction, but also to intervene right during the course of daily instruction. This year, Menasha started around the 30th percentile for their math scores, looked at the students who were scoring in that 30th percentile, looked at their corresponding WKCE scores and their ACT Explore, and started making some phone calls to parents and offering reading intervention. It's not a perfect system. They're still working on developing their multi-level system of support. So what kinds of supports are they offering to those students who logistically couldn't be in reading intervention, or who had to make a difficult choice between band and reading intervention or arts and reading intervention? So it's not a perfect system yet, but they're serving the greatest number of students that they're able to based on data. So we've looked at a few examples today. We thought about PALS in 4K, 5K, and grade 1. We heard about the screening that's being done in Oshkosh, the screening that's being done in Menasha, and we encourage you to take these questions and these stories back to your own schools, maybe in a professional learning community, really thinking about what tools do you use for screening all students, what information are those tools giving you, and also how are you storing that data? How are you talking about that data? How are you analyzing that data? And how are you prioritizing which students are receiving which types of reading interventions?
I think part of that, how are you analyzing the data question, I think a sub part of that question is how often are you analyzing the data? So that's, I would add that as well.
This movement out of intervention should really be a fluid process into and out of, and sometimes back into intervention based on how a student is developing. And I think the other thing that's really important to point out is that we, in our examples today, we're really focusing on the students who aren't understanding the context yet. As we're talking about intervention, we also need to have systems in place for providing appropriate instruction for the students who screening data shows already have mastered the standard. So response to intervention and multi-level system of support isn't just about struggling students, it's about all students.
Absolutely. So just as a reminder, here are some resources that you have available when you're making those determinations about which students are in need of additional reading support. So at the first address at the top of your screen is a link to the statutory requirements in the state of Wisconsin. So you can find more details, for example, about Standard C, about licensure requirements regarding who can provide reading intervention, those kinds of questions, and some supplementary webinars on those specific topics. For information about PALS, you can follow that PALS Wisconsin link. For specific information about Title I, there's a link there for you to find further information and details around your Title I programming. For decision-making rules and to find out what kinds of supports the Wisconsin RTI Center has to offer, including hearing from other schools, you can follow that bullet point there. We also have, of course, a whole collection of professional learning on demand, and so you can follow that link. And, of course, follow us on Twitter.
Thanks so much for taking the time to watch today's webinar. The next webinar that we're moving into, the third in this 2013-2014 series, is really about structuring intervention. How do you make time in your daily schedule to offer intervention for those students who need it? How does that intervention interact with universal instruction? And what's the framework that's used, not just for your universal instruction, but also for your intervention? So we hope that you found today's information useful, and we look forward to going one step further in the process.
Here's our contact information. If you have any questions or any feedback, any concerns, or success stories to share with us, please contact us at any time. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.